Thank you. You've talked a bit about culture already. I mean, to what extent was there room for nationalist feelings during the Soviet period, and how were they expressed despite state oppression?
Yeah, so I spoke a little bit about the interwar period, and indeed, this the cultural flowering of the interwar period, it became what is known as executed Renaissance, because most of the people who were active during the interwar period, they were executed. Some of them were physically sort of executed, right? Some of them were forced to serve the regime. Some of them went into exile, and so on and so on. So that generation was, we can say that the interwar generation, it was destroyed indeed. But then in the 1960s, in the 1950s and 1960s, we see the new generation and the rise of so-called, the dissident movement in Ukraine. And again, it coincides with Nikita Khrushchev's coming to power and de-Stalinization. But at the same time, it's we see how on the one hand, or on the outside, this de-Stalinization was meant to sort of rectify those mistakes of Stalin, not to use terror, not to be perhaps again more open or more tolerant across the Soviet Union. But as the experience of Ukraine shows, in the 1960s, there were a lot of repressions. Perhaps they were not mass repressions as during the 1930s, but in the 1960s, those dissidents, or in the early 1970s as well, they were also arrested. They were not allowed to kind of express openly this Ukrainian sentiment, Ukrainian feelings. But at the same time, it's not to say that Ukrainian culture or culture in the Ukrainian language disappeared. No, it wasn't the case. And this is why the interwar period is important. This is the period of this transition from Ukrainian culture, we can say Ukrainian nationalist culture, to Ukrainian Soviet culture, where culture becomes more compliant with the regime. It is still in the Ukrainian language, but culture sort of loses this political meaning. It becomes more about just, I don't know, sometimes you can see that the culture of the Soviet period is more folklore-like, so it's not modern, but it's going back sort of to those folklore-esque motifs and so on and so on. So it was very compliant with this kind of the state's idea of how Soviet culture more generally should look like. And this was encapsulated in the Stalin's maxim of socialist in content, national in form, so that the message is the same, but the form can be Ukrainian, Georgian, whatever, Lithuanian. It can be in any language, but it should be the content, the message should still be the same.
Great, and thank you. And then maybe again, like to the disintegration of the Soviet Union, are there any particular events that like come to your mind where you say, okay, that can be seen as sparking nationalist feelings more openly again?
Well, you mean in the 90s, in the 1980s? So of course, I think the Chernobyl disaster, the Chernobyl catastrophe was a real push for this understanding that the Soviet authorities, those authorities in Moscow, they are basically, we can say, the king is naked, basically. And this is when it also started with culture is also very important here, because we see a lot of new voices appearing during this time in the mid 1980s, and they are all, it's not that they are inspired by the Chernobyl disaster, but they kind of empowered by it. And we have new voices. This is this generation that later on in the 1990s would form the basis for the modern Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian canon. But we can say that this integration started with the Chernobyl disaster, and and kind of the reaction, the Moscow reaction to the disaster, where people in Ukraine especially saw that perhaps this wasn't the form of statehood they wanted.
Great, thank you.
So I think I need to ask about it actually, because we will talk a lot about Soviet Union and Ukraine in it and all of that stuff. But I need to ask you about the question about the parts in it in other countries. They took also a part in it. I mean, like a Cold War and NATO, Europe, USA, and all of that stuff. Yep, and a lot of people are thinking that the problem of this war, what we have right now in Ukraine, it's between NATO and Russia. Do you think that I mean, it could be in history that Russia was promised that the NATO would not expand eastwards? What do you think about it? What's your opinion about it?
Well, yeah, indeed, it's kind of, the war is being by many interpreted as the war between Moscow and NATO, and Ukraine is just basically a battlefield as a proxy, but indeed Kremlin and Putin never even tried to hide that they saw this NATO expansion or any promise of membership for Ukraine in NATO as a threat to Russian sovereignty. And there is this myth really that NATO promised not to expand eastwards, and hence Putin is claiming that NATO broke this promise by allowing those countries of what was called the Warsaw Pact to join NATO. So it was Romania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, so Czechia, and Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary. So all those countries in Eastern Europe, they all became members of NATO. The Baltic states as well, of course. And it is interesting that indeed, there was an agreement between NATO countries and the Soviet Union before the breakup in December 1991, and this was the Treaty of Final Settlement with respect to Germany. But the only country that was somehow discussed in that context was Germany, was East Germany, right? So that NATO promised. Basically, the specific promise was made related to Germany in the territory of the former GDR, that there would be no NATO forces in Eastern Germany. This was the only kind of promise that was made, and perhaps it was they didn't speak about any other countries of the former Warsaw Pact because it was unconceivable at the time, right? Kind of, it was not. How could even one think in 1990 or 1991 that there would be a breakup of the Soviet Union, that all those countries would be independent, that Russia would become a threat to those countries with whom they had so many contacts and so on and so on. But the thing is that later on in the 90s, these were those countries that asked NATO to accept them. So it wasn't NATO that was seeking actively to engage those countries, but those countries, especially the Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, they felt threatened by Russia. So to enhance their security, they asked for protection, so to say. So it wasn't the movement from NATO, but the movement from those countries. And obviously, if those countries fulfilled all the requirements for entry and they wished to join, NATO accepted them. But at the same time, there was no promise as such not to pursue this eastward expansion.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you.
And I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think to this day there are no NATO soldiers or any kind of military bases of the US, for example, in Eastern Germany. In Western Germany, yes, but not in Eastern Germany. So I guess we could technically say that this promise was kept.
Yes, exactly. So there was an official agreement, and NATO stayed true to this agreement. But since there was no agreement about other countries, yes, they acted. Yeah, they didn't basically break any promise, so to say.
So you think like, oh, sorry, I would ask it. So you think that the Russia is the problem actually in this, that they broke this agreement? They were the first.
Well, I guess they didn't break this agreement because the agreement was about Germany, right? It's not, if there was no agreement for NATO not to expand, what do you mean? What would Russia break? But Russia broke all other possible agreements, right? There was an agreement, the Budapest Memorandum, which was about, basically this was a memorandum where Russia is one of the signatories and one of the guarantors of Ukraine's sovereignty. So basically, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, and Russia, together with other, with Great Britain, with the US, and I don't know who else was there, but they are guarantors of Ukraine's sovereignty. So by occupying Crimea, they already violated this very important document. And even before that, I believe in the 1970s, there was this Helsinki Agreement, which also where all signatories guaranteed, sort of sovereignty and inviolability of borders. And Russia is also one of the signatories. So it's there are so many agreements that Russia broke that, how can you even trust them or treat them as equal partners? And exactly, so.
That's for sure. Thank you a lot for your answer.
Yes, so our next question is about Maidan protests in 2013 and 2014. So what were the reasons for this protest, and who was like the main initiator, the main organizers of them, and like what groups of the society?
Yeah, well, this is the protest, the Maidan protests, and what later became known as the Revolution of Dignity. This was a grassroots initiative, and every year, in late November, there is this, we see again and again, those recollection how it all started. It all started with a post, right? With a Facebook post after Yanukovych basically decided to withdrew from this agreement with the European Union, where there was this turn of the course, of the official course that Ukraine has been following for years. And it all started with a Facebook post when people went out to Maidan in the heart of Kyiv, and basically the government or the president reacted violently. The police special forces tried to basically stop this demonstration, mainly of students, of young people. And as a result, thousands came out the next day. And this is how it all started. This was a grassroots initiative. It was, a true example of activism and a strong civil society, which was there in Ukraine. And the kind of events escalated. We know about the killings of at least 100 people on February 2021, and basically, but people didn't go away, right? The demonstrations, the protests were ongoing for months, and it all resulted in President Yanukovych fleeing the country, and new elections, and Petro Poroshenko became president. And at the same time, on the other hand, the Revolution of Dignity led to the occupation of Crimea and the involvement of Russia in Donetsk and Luhansk and support of those self-proclaimed republics. So this is how the war started as well. So we can say that late November 2013, this is when actually the war between Russia and Ukraine started. It didn't start in February 2022. It started in November 2013, and the occupation of Crimea. And you asked me what people why people started to protest in 2013, 2014. So exactly, I mean, perhaps the most obvious answer is that they demanded those closer relationship with the EU. But at the same time, it wasn't just that, right? As the protest grew, as the protest continued, this was also the rejection of this post-Soviet politics, of corruption, of nepotism, of this turn back towards Russia, of any potential alliance with Russia. And this is why those protests became known as the Revolution of Dignity, because people also fought for some, for values, for those values of freedom, civic society, free democratic elections. This is everything that the West, the EU stood for those people, and yeah, so this is why people went to the streets, and I guess this is why we are still at war, because people are still fighting for those values, and those values are still being kind of compromised and violated by another side.
Yep, I see. And I think there is one more question that we should clarify. Because as I said, I'm Ukrainian and I was born and raised in Ukraine-speaking family, city, and all of that stuff. But we all know and that we have like two languages in Ukraine. People speak as well Ukrainian as Russian. And the question is there is any connection between ethnicity and language? If you live in Ukraine and you speak Russian, are you Russian, or why do so many people speak Russian in Ukraine? That's the biggest question that's bothering me, and I think the other people should also know like answer.
Well, it's another good question. Perhaps I'll start with this question: why so many people speak Russian in Ukraine? It's this ongoing legacy of the imperial and Soviet legacy, right? When cities were seen, when we speak about kind of the Soviet times, cities were seen as so basically the proletariat was international proletariat, right? Even kind of the reference back to the interwar period when those Ukraine-minded party members were trying to extend Ukrainization, the Ukrainization to the working class, saying that the workers in the cities should also speak Ukrainian. The party opposed, and this is what actually Stalin himself addressed in one of his letters, saying the proletariat is an international proletariat. This is our like kind of main basis of support. They cannot be Ukrainized, and this is why this legacy remained. That cities were Russian speaking and against kind of Ukrainian speaking countryside, and it despite all those promises to fight great Russian chauvinism, as they called it, that has never been achieved. And this is what we have. What we had in 1991, and the legacy was still witnessed in Ukraine. And you asked about the difference between whether ethnicity and language, whether they are connected. Well, of course, because there is still, Russians are still the largest ethnic community in Ukraine. I think according to 2001 census, there were 17% of ethnic Russians in Ukraine, and especially in Crimea and in the east of Ukraine. And this is a result, again, not only Russification, but also population exchanges, which were made during the Soviet period, when, especially in Crimea, following the forced deportation of the indigenous Crimean Tatar people in 1944, a lot of Russians were brought in. So the entire makeup of the peninsula changed as a result of that deportation. So we have the peninsula was made kind of not only Russian speaking, but also predominantly ethnic Russian. indeed, a lot of people are bilingual. A lot of people speak, or perhaps all people in Ukraine speak Russian as well, or at least understand it. It depends on the context, on the family, on the part of Ukraine. But what is interesting is that the share of those Ukrainian citizens and ethnically Ukrainian people who declare Russian as their mother tongue steadily decreases. It decreases steadily since 1991. So perhaps it's very slow, which is a reference to perhaps like kind of the weak state policy towards or support to the Ukrainian language, but it decreases. And especially in the context of war today, what we see when a lot of people from the south, from the east, those territories which are more Russian speaking, that they switch to Ukrainian, they start learning Ukrainian, they don't want to be associated with Russia, with the aggressor. And I think what we will witness is that more and more people will become Ukrainian speakers and will declare Ukrainian as their mother tongue rather than Russian. But at the same time, I just want to highlight that that Ukraine is kind of culturally and linguistically diverse country. And indeed, we speak about Russian, but there is also, there are a lot of Hungarians, Hungarian speakers, there are a lot of Romanian speakers, and so on and so on. It depends which border you look at, right? Ukraine has 7 members, and all those borderlands have this ethnically, culturally, linguistically, religiously mixed populations. And but at the same time, we see that it's not about the language; it's about allegiances, and those loyalties are with the central government, and the more so in view of the war. So I think this is what we are witnessing now, and this will be one of the results of the war, that Ukraine will become a very strong, unified civic nation, regardless of the language people use.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And also, when I'm going to my childhood, I don't know, maybe you had the same problem, but it was told me when I came to Kyiv or all of the big cities, you shouldn't speak Ukrainian because it's like a village language, that you came from village and you speak Ukrainian, please speak Russian. And I was so confused. I mean, like, what? What does it mean? And now it changed. I can see it, that the people in Kyiv, they try to speak Ukrainian, and I'm so proud of them. They do it really, because it's our mother tongue. It's okay. It's not a village language.
Yes, yeah, it's totally true, because I know I was born in Shepetivka, which is sort of to the west, but just in between Lviv and Kyiv, and I came to Kyiv when I was 14 to study at school, and I actually I never switched to Russian. I always spoke Ukrainian, and I actually made my friends switch to Ukrainian when they spoke to me.
Wow.
But I think it takes a lot of courage, because indeed you are going against the current. And I was sometimes I was the only one at I had this like part-time job. I was also perhaps the only one who spoke Ukrainian, but as you say, this is my language. And I always, to be honest, I always detested those people who would speak on the phone on the train in Ukrainian, and the moment they get off the train, they switch to Russian. And I always feel like, why? So I never fell into that trap. And but you're right. I think kind of the so-called Ukrainization of Kyiv and of other big cities is obvious, and it's just kind of going slowly. And I think there needs to be more institutional support, like kind of legislative support for the Ukrainian language. And it doesn't mean that other languages are being that there is discrimination or anything. It's just that, unfortunately, yes, there is this long-standing legacy of Russification, And somehow we need to deal with that, and especially in the view of war, when language, the same language, is being used to say that those people should be part of Russia.
Yeah. Yes, I understand you completely. Yes, Sarah, please.
So yeah, this is already the end of this episode. But as I've said at the beginning, this should be considered as an invitation to learn more about Ukraine's history. So can you give us a recommendation for a book, a film, a documentary, something like that, that you wish more people knew about on the topic that we discussed today?
Well, I would just recommend any book by Serhiy Plokhy. That I guess the Gate of Europe is perhaps the best overview of Ukrainian history that that anyone can read and learn about it. But at the same time, I would recommend perhaps just to watch perhaps those best those examples of Ukrainian films, for instance. The Man with a Movie Camera by Zeha Verta, which is always somehow attributed as to Russia, or Alexander Dovzhenko's Zemlya, or perhaps Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors, just to see what pearls, what gems are there. That Ukrainian art has always developed as part of a European tradition rather than the Russian tradition. Same we can say about Ukrainian modernism, Ukrainian artists, and so on and so on. So I would say that, yeah, I would recommend to start with Serhiy Plokhy, but also to look for those examples, the best examples of Ukrainian art, whether cinema, literature, or the arts, just to see what is there and explore for them for yourself.
Thank you for this recommendation, and also thank you so much for being here with us. It was very interesting, and I think we all learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you once again for the invitation.
Thank you a lot.
Thank you.